There are two principal forms in which education and human rights relate. The first is that education is one of the human rights reflected in Article 26 of the Declaration. The second is that as a global social contract, these rights need to be taught in order to be first known and secondly accepted. The right to education enabled significant progress in advancing access to school around the world, but there has been far less global progress in educating for human rights. This is because the educational aspirations contained in the Declaration were captured by narrower aspirations that diverted from the purpose of fostering peace. As a result of this goal displacement, the institutions that were built to advance the right to education are today poorly equipped to foster education for human rights, because a lot of that expansion took place with low-cost systems and with teachers that have not been sufficiently well educated. There are also imbalances in the role of transnational institutions in advancing the right to education. And so, in many ways, I'm going to argue we need to repurpose the right to education, to go back to the roots of this right, developing a narrative that links human rights education to global civility and citizenship. Now, education as a human right. I want to focus your attention on the very humanistic vision described in the second paragraph of Article 26. This explicit statement is very consequential in the field of education. The debates of what should be the purpose of schools are long within our field, and I will come back to that point in a moment. The idea that all persons should be educated, of course, was not original to those who drafted the Declaration. The first known proponent of this idea was Czech educator John Amos Comenius, who made the case for universal education in his Didactica Magna in 1636. And he did so because he thought violence was brought about by the limited understandings of people, and he believed that in educating them, they would be less likely to resort to violence as a way to resolve differences. Comenius, of course, had himself experienced 30 years of violence in the form of a war, which had taken the lives of his wife and 2 sons. Now, in many ways, it is very much the same rationale that universal education would contribute to peace that inspired those who included the right of education in the Declaration. The Constitution of UNESCO, the UN agency created as part of the UN system to work to achieve the right of education, reads that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be built. Now, in adopting the proposition that the purpose of working to achieve education for all was to contribute to peace, in explicitly stating the aspiration that these would contribute to plant the defenses of peace in the minds of people, and in the second paragraph of Article 26, which talks about the purpose of the full development of people, human rights law was taking a clear stance in an old debate on the purposes of schools. One side of this debate was well represented by educational philosopher, Swiss educator Pestalozzi, who argued that education should aim to develop the full personality of people, that it should be staged to follow the stages in the development of learners, and that it should be relevant to the lives of people. Pestalozzi attempted unsuccessfully to persuade Napoleon to build public education systems following these principles, but Napoleon was too busy fighting his wars. Another side of this debate was well represented by Joseph Lancaster, who developed an approach that allowed teaching large numbers of children at low cost. The monitorial system, a system of peer-based education and of a highly structured basic curriculum. Lancaster proposed that such a system should focus on developing a limited range of core skills, basic literacy and numeracy. His monitorial system was at the core of the massive expansion of public education which took place in the late 1800s and early 1900s, preceding thus the Human Rights Declaration. Now, in proposing the universal right to education, the Declaration contributed to a dramatic expansion of educational opportunity around the world. 60 years ago, the vast majority of the world's children did not have the opportunity to attend school. Today, most of them begin and complete at least elementary education, and many have also the opportunity to continue their education at more advanced levels. Globally, 9 in 10 children of primary school age are enrolled in school today, and 9 in 10 of those live in developing countries. We can think of the Declaration as a social contract, a non-binding contract, but an aspirational contract, especially because this contract is non-binding in states that have adopted the Declaration. Those who are to be governed by this contract need to be inculcated in it. For this reason, since the Declaration was adopted, the General Assembly of the UN has repeatedly called for widespread dissemination of the little document that I hope you are taking with you. But more than a document to be disseminated, the Declaration also provides the guidelines for a curriculum of instruction. Because the Declaration sets out to achieve social changes that require individual and collective action, this is a curriculum aimed not just at providing learners with the knowledge of these rights, but with a form of knowledge that will commit them to action and shape also their views of what is morally acceptable. The Declaration provides then the basis for a curriculum of citizenship, of a particular form of citizenship that enables collective interdependent action, that is to say, of global citizenship. I think it is in recommending the right to education, in reconnecting the right of education and human rights education to the development of global citizenship that we can best close the implementation gap with regards to this right, what I will describe in a moment as the human rights education paradox. Over the last 60 years, numerous agencies have worked in developing methodologies to teach human rights, and we're going to hear today from 3 colleagues different ways to teach human rights. And this has supported the expansion of opportunities to learn human rights around the world. However, the record on the extent to which these rights are taught to all children who are schooled is less impressive than the record on the expansion of access to schools which the right to education made possible. Between 1995 and 2004, the UN sponsored a number of activities in this field under the banner of the Decade for Human Rights Education. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights plays an important role in supporting human rights education, supporting national and local capacities for human rights education in the context of its technical cooperation program and through the project of technical assistance in this area, which provides financial assistance to grassroots initiatives, developing selected human rights education and training materials. For example, this handbook compiles a body of knowledge about the practice of human rights education. And the content of this report illustrates very well contemporary thinking in this area and practice in this area. The distinction between teaching about human rights and for human rights, for example. The importance of learning human rights in environments that help students live those rights. The General Assembly recognized this distinction in 1994 in stating that human rights education should involve more than the provision of information and should constitute a comprehensive lifelong process by which people at all levels in development and in all strata of society learn respect for the dignity of others and the means and methods of ensuring that respect in all societies. This document calls for specific actions that schools should take to promote human rights education, such as the incorporation of human rights education in national legislation regulating schools, the revision of curricula and textbooks, pre-service and in-service training for teachers, the organization of extracurricular activities, the development of educational materials, and the establishment of support networks of teachers and other professionals from human rights groups, teachers' unions, non-governmental organizations, or professional associations, and so on. The document goes as far as to propose a developmental progression of milestones that learners should achieve during the course of their studies. Among the many practical suggestions contained in this document are, for example, teaching the Declaration not in the language in this book, but in language that is accessible to young readers. And you have an example of what that would mean in that slide. Along with the efforts of the UN High Commission for Human Rights, numerous other intergovernmental organizations or non-governmental organizations, international, national, and local, have expanded the knowledge base about how to teach human rights. And in a moment, our 3 speakers are going to give an example of that. Before they do, let me suggest that we face a human rights education paradox. If the right to education was predicated as a way to contribute to peace, and if there has been much progress in achieving the right to education, and if it is known that human rights education is necessary, and if we have a body of knowledge of codified good practice about human rights education, where is the problem? Where's the challenge? The challenge is that human rights are not widely known or taught in schools throughout the world, that when they are taught, in most cases, students do not learn to apply that knowledge with the way in which they interact with others, and that the education many students experience in many ways negates their basic human rights, and in some cases openly teaches them that members of other groups do not have the same rights as they do, hence violating the basic premise and aspiration of the Declaration of Dignity and Justice for All. If we accept with John Dewey that how we teach is what we teach, we can think of the actual pedagogical experiences of students around the world as placed somewhere in a continuum that ranges from living in a school where human rights are experienced daily and where students reflect on these rights, to living in schools where intolerance is openly taught and practiced. The reasons why this happens are multi-layered. They include the fact that the international covenants which have driven much of the progress on the right to education do not focus explicitly on human rights education. In this sense, the original purpose of the right to education was hijacked to serve narrower purposes, empty of the moral aspiration to contribute to plant the seeds of peace in the minds of people. For example, the Millennium Development Goals, a very important compact to reduce poverty around the world, include 2 education objectives, but both are quantitative targets of expansion in access to school. It is perfectly possible to subscribe to the MDGs and to receive funding from the Fast Track Development Initiative to put in place reforms to achieve these rights and to use these funds to finance a curriculum, textbooks, or teacher training that openly teach intolerance among people. The Education for All framework, an expanded set of educational goals proposed by UNESCO and subscribed by all member states, does not focus explicitly on human rights either. Given the fact that human rights education does not have, for the international community, the same priority afforded the right to education, it is then up to each national government to determine what priority to give human rights education in achieving the right to education. Not surprisingly, those societies where human rights fare the worst are those where human rights education is also lacking. In addition, in societies where human rights are included as part of the curriculum of instruction and formally taught in a civics or social studies course in some grades, there is wide variation in the extent to which there are adequate professional opportunities, development opportunities for teachers to learn to teach human rights, which is another way to say that human rights education is not an education policy priority in many countries. In addition to the lack of explicit priority to human rights education, another reason why they are not taught is because in many societies the quality of instruction is very poor. Poorly educated teachers teach poorly not just human rights, but most of what they try to teach. Teachers with limited reflective skills and poorly educated in subject matter or child development are likely to behave in ways that replicate larger social patterns of interaction among adults and children, some of which, such as physical punishment, violate the rights of children. The social context of schools often also reproduces larger patterns of social interaction outside of schools. In many countries, there is violence in schools, not just from adults to children, but among children themselves. There is, around the world, an unexamined epidemic of bullying and of use of corporal punishment by teachers in schools, and the way in which schools are organized in much of the world fosters forms of interaction that negate the basic rights of children. So human rights are not taught in schools or in teacher education institutions. So where do we go from here? Right back to the beginning, to recognizing that the right to education and human rights education were meant to be Siamese twins. The right to education was predicated as a path to contribute to peace and to curb violence, to foster a sense of global interdependence in the commitment to dignity and justice. In short, to foster global citizenship. We need a new narrative of why we need human rights education as a way to build a broad advocacy coalition that would give this purpose serious priority in the crowded agenda of governments and education leaders. If we succeed in explaining to the broad public why global citizenship is one of the goals for schools in the 21st century, and explain how human rights education can contribute to this goal, we will be able to use the existing knowledge about which pedagogies that effectively teach human rights and to create conditions in schools that are supportive of the use of those pedagogies. Now, this is feasible and has been done and can be done at a cost affordable to most education systems. The most important shift that human rights education could foster in many education systems is one where teachers do less and students do more, take responsibility for their learning, and have the opportunity to have a voice in the classroom and in the school. Let me conclude this introduction and then introduce our speakers, referring to a large study I am conducting in Mexico, in the states of Guerrero, in the south of Mexico, and in Nuevo León in the north. In this study, involving 120 teachers, we are examining alternative ways to develop citizenship skills among 14-year-olds. In all cases, we have established a system of professional development which involves creating communities where teachers discuss with facilitators good practices and where they analyze the results of the projects they are implementing in their schools. In a context of growing violence, I have been surprised by how enthusiastic teachers, but especially students, are about the subjects and the work they are doing in these civics courses. One of the approaches we're examining gives students the opportunity to work on projects of their choosing, where they are to make a difference in their communities. I visited some of those schools a couple of months ago and asked the students what they thought of those activities. Many of them indicated that the reason they valued this particular subject was because it was the only one where they had the opportunity to participate actively in class discussions, because they were able to bring in reflections from their lives outside the school into the school, and they were able to decide what projects to pursue. It sounds pretty basic, and in some ways it is, but it is also very powerful in a context where the traditional pedagogical culture gives very limited voice to students. With the aim of helping students learn to value dignity and justice for all, what could be more important? Let me now introduce the speakers in the order in which they are going to address us tonight. Felisa Tibbitts is the director and co-founder of Human Rights Education Associates, an internationally recognized non-governmental organization dedicated to education and learning about human rights. Ms. Tibbitts began her work in the human rights education field in the early 1990s in post-totalitarian Europe. She has supported national curricular reforms in human rights, law-related and civic education programming in Albania, China, Croatia, Estonia, Northern Ireland, Morocco, Romania, Ukraine, and has carried out training in over 20 countries. Her current teaching efforts are focused on the topics of human rights education, monitoring children's rights, the human rights-based approach to programming, and research and evaluation in the NGO sector. In addition to teaching these online courses for her own organization, she is a visiting professor at the United Nations University for Peace in Costa Rica. Felisa has published extensively and is a consultative expert for the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNICEF, UNESCO, the Council of Europe, and the Open Society Institute. She's a member of the editorial board for the journal Intercultural Education, Amnesty International USA Steering Committee for Human Rights Education, and the Organization of the Americas Advisory Council on Democratic and Human Rights Education. She was trained in educational research, planning, and policy through master's programs at the Kennedy School and Education School here at Harvard. Adam Strom, who will be the next presenter, is the Director of Research and Development at Facing History and Ourselves. Adam is the principal author and editor of numerous Facing History publications that are distributed in print, online, and through new media tools to educators around the globe. From the organization's worldwide headquarters in Boston, he directs a team that plans, writes, researches, and develops resource books, study guides, and lesson planning resources, and you'll be able to see some of those at the exhibit in the reception. Mr. Strom also facilitates staff development programs, both online and face-to-face, for educators around the world. He has primary responsibility for Facing History and Ourselves International Scholars Board and for the Harvard Law School Facing History Project, which develops educational materials and sponsors major international conferences. He's currently directing Civic Dilemmas in a Changing World, Religion, Migration, and Belonging, a 3-year initiative undertaken by the organization. This project will create educational resources that focus on the experiences of young people and the challenges they and their families face with immigration, citizenship, and assimilation in contemporary Europe. He's also the primary editor of Making History, a new series of educational resources linking history to civic education. And he has numerous recent publications, too many for me to mention right now. Edwin Gragert, Dr. Gragert, is the Executive Director of iEARN USA. Since 1988, iEARN has pioneered the educational use of communications technology and teacher professional development to facilitate online project work in elementary and secondary schools in 125 countries worldwide. Approximately 2 million students are working every day on collaborative projects through iEARN. He has served as the Executive Director of ICYE-US, an international high school and community service youth exchange program, and also served on the staff of the International Relations Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. Ed received his Bachelor in Japanese Political Science from the University of Washington and his Master's in Korean History from Columbia University. His PhD at Columbia was in Japanese history, focusing on land ownership changes under Japanese colonial administration in the early 20th century. And his dissertation was published by Columbia and the University of Hawaii in 1994. So after we hear from them, we're going to have a conversation with those of you in the audience. Felisa?
Check? Check it. It's good. Okay. Just these here. Yeah. Thanks. Use this as well. Either one. All right. Just this to the right. Thank you. Okay. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank the Harvard Graduate School of Education, in particular Professor Reimers, for inviting me to be with you this evening. I am working full-time in human rights education and learning, and I'll confess that it's not exclusively in the school systems. And part of what I thought I might do this evening that perhaps the other speakers wouldn't have an equal opportunity to do is actually tell you a little bit about the human rights framework and its relevance to each of us, and speak a little bit broadly also about education and training in the human rights sector. I won't spend too much time on it, but I thought I'd like you to walk away with a little bit more information than just what my organization is doing in terms of human rights education programming. So what I'd like to address this in my 15 minutes is, on the one hand, just to tell you a little bit about human rights standards and principles. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that nice blue passport that's outside on the table, was the foundation of international human rights treaties and standards, and a lot of that's very difficult to understand. So I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about that, just so that you can walk away with a little knowledge about that. Then I'm going to speak a little bit about human rights education, in particular as a support for the international human rights movement, which is what this is all about. And finally, the work of my own organization, HREA, and how we try to support the international human rights movement through education and training. So this is the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I understand was part of the reason why this was organized this evening. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was... there was a picture you saw in Professor Reimers' presentation of Eleanor Roosevelt holding it up. That she was the coordinator of the working committee for that, and it was the first statement to include every individual on the planet. And of course, it was just the start, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as Professor Reimers said, wasn't binding. It was a political document at the time. It became the basis for a number of international legally binding treaties and covenants, but it is the inspiration for the human rights framework that we all work with. So as a consequence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being passed 60 years ago, a number of binding instruments were developed. For example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and also on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. These constitute part of what's known as international human rights standards. And I wanted you to know that, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the inspiration for all the evolving, in fact, set of human rights standards that we have out there. But the way that standards work, which is important for understanding, for example, the work of organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, is that covenants like the like the two I just mentioned on civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights, countries have the option to sign and ratify these, which make them legally binding inside the countries. Then they're supposed to harmonize their national laws so that they're consistent with these contents. And there's accountability that's provided through watchdog agencies like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, through public awareness, just being aware in your own country what your legislators have signed on to and what human rights they're supposed to be promoting and protecting, through the international community, naming and shaming in reports that you read, every week at least, that are coming out from international watchdog agencies, and something called the Universal Periodic Review, which the UN itself is going to be carrying out, has started to carry out since last year, the Human Rights Council. And I mention all this in part so to highlight public awareness as a piece of this, because inside of all this, as Professor Reimers said, the aspiration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are the hard laws that get passed, signed and ratified by governments, and the accountability mechanisms that are out there to help ensure that governments do their best, in fact, to promote and protect human rights. And public awareness is a piece of that. So this connects back to our themes for this evening. And the thesis is that unless citizens such as ourselves, unless teachers and children are aware of their own human rights, there's not going to be a full accountability to national elites around these human rights. So the piece of human rights, so education is partly to support the human rights framework. Now, you're going to probably hear a different point of view, and there's lots of other rationales for, globalizing and schools and having human rights piece there. But from the perspective of the international human rights movement and promoting and protecting human rights, from that perspective, education and training is instrumental towards public awareness. And I just wanted to give you that perspective on this. I also wanted to make a distinction for you because this is very relevant for curriculum in schools, which I'm actually not going to talk a great deal about. When I present the programming of my organization, I'm going to touch on some of the things we do. And if you're interested, I'll go into greater detail in the discussion period. But I wanted to make a distinction between the standards, the human rights standards, which are these binding treaties and covenants, and human rights principles, such as equality and non-discrimination, participation and inclusion, accountability, and the rule of law. These are actually established in internal UN documents. And I think this is just something to keep in mind because how human rights content and values and practices shows up in schools will depend on your understanding about what human rights are and what's relevant for schools. So, for example, you might find someone thinking that human rights education is just knowledge about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But Professor Reimers already intimated that human rights is intended to be practiced, which would mean that the culture of the school, the practices between students and teachers would also be highly relevant. That's certainly the case. And you also have these kinds of values, which are linked not only, of course, with human rights, but other kinds of value systems that are out there in schools. I think an interesting question for us is, what does human rights add to citizenship education? And if you want, we can talk about that. But I did want to make this distinction, and perhaps to highlight that human rights education is not only about the standards, but I would also argue, as a purist, that unless you do address the standards in schools, I wouldn't call it human rights education. I mean, that's sort of like it's necessary but not sufficient, perhaps, for schools. So that's a bit on human rights in the background. I won't give you more, but I wanted to give you a bigger framework for human rights education in schools from the context of the human rights standards, the human rights framework, and the principles. So as Professor Reimers mentioned already, the human rights education was actually emphasized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was in the preamble, as you can see for yourself. It's also human rights and education for human rights has been reiterated in other UN documents. There are a number of them. In fact, there's a whole publication that the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights put out about this thick, which culled all the places where human rights education has been called for by the member states. And every treaty that a government signs, a human rights treaty that is signed, always has a clause, usually at the end, that they're therefore obliged to inform their citizens that they have signed these treaties and they should educate them about that. Getting back to the idea of public awareness. So I mentioned earlier, a good question, again, moving from the perspective of the human rights movement to education and training, is what's the relationship? And this is pretty much, I think, the thesis, that if there's increased human rights awareness and increased human rights practices, and I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that through the work of my organization, among non-state actors, meaning because it's the governments who are officially responsible for promoting human rights, at least from the perspective of the United Nations, then presumably there's going to be increased pressure on governments to respect human rights. So that's the whole thesis, right? So that's where the education and training fits in. And the last piece on education, because again, I think this is relevant for schools. I'm sort of giving you the big picture, and then I'll narrow in a bit. I worked for many years in this field, and I find many different approaches have emerged. And human rights education in schools is a very strong focus of the work that's done. And the UN, through the Decade for Human Rights Education that Professor Reimers mentioned, has strongly promoted work in schools. There's also a World Program for Human Rights Education that started a couple of years ago, and the first phase is focusing on the schooling sector. I thought a lot about the different kinds of approaches and target groups that are out there, and the schooling sector has primarily, these are ideal types, but primarily the human rights education has been awareness raising and values oriented. I find that limited, by the way, so it's not what I'm endorsing, but I think that's descriptive. Much of what is happening in schools, if it's happening in schools around human rights education, tends to be very, very, very superficial and very, it's not useless, but it's very preliminary, it's very general. There is another kind of education and training practice that goes on, which is around professionals, because there are people out there whose main jobs are to work in the field of human rights, like human rights monitors. And so there is education and training also taking place for those professionals whose formal responsibilities would either have them responsible for promoting and protecting human rights, or whose responsibilities, such as prison staff or police, put them in a position where they could potentially violate human rights. So human rights education and training also takes place for those kinds of civil servants. That's another whole area. That's not even schooling, but I wanted you to think about outside of schooling what kind of education and training might be taking place. And there's finally another kind of approach. These are ideal types. They're not really mutually exclusive, but I'm presenting them discreetly, is the idea of human rights education as a medium for transformation. So there are many human rights education programs, for example, taking place with marginalized groups or rural women, minorities, with community development organizations whose intention is to really, it's very psychosocial in approach. It sort of tries to bring back a sense of self-respect through the idea that they own human rights, and through that experience cultivated very carefully through human rights education and other social supports, they change their lives. And it's a transformative approach, and it can work at the level of the individual and the family, and it can also lift up into activism. But that's a very explicit and very unique approach within human rights education and training as well. So, having introduced you to these four broader ideas, I'd like to speak a little bit about the work of my organization. Human Rights Education Associates was started in 1996, and it was started at the time by myself and the person, I was working for a Dutch human rights group, and a colleague was working for Amnesty International in London. And we were both the only people in our organizations at the time, well, pretty much, who were focusing on education and training within human rights organizations whose main jobs were monitoring. And we felt it was really important to have an organization that was focused exclusively on education and training and pedagogy as a mechanism for essentially preventing human rights violations and abuses. And that was the origins of this organization. It is non-governmental. It was founded originally in the Netherlands, but we're pretty much just here in the U.S. now. And it's involved in professional development of human rights defenders and educators. We were actually very much a capacity-building organization. We do have curriculum, which I'll mention, but we see ourselves as actually trying to facilitate the professionalization and practice of human rights education in many, many countries. And we do provide services in over 150 countries now. So I'll just overview some of what we do. One is direct training of human rights defenders and educators. The human rights defenders that we've trained, primarily through our online courses, we have a whole, I think we're offering 24 online courses this year. I'll tell you a little bit more about them, are people that, as I mentioned, would be, in this case, have direct responsibility for promoting and protecting human rights. So we have individuals working with human rights commissions, the courts, human rights observers, We also work with human rights educators, people such as yourselves, who are in schools or faculties at universities and teacher training colleges or at ministries of education. This is a little bit more detail on the kinds of defenders we're speaking about. They could be working for the UN. We train a lot of UN people, actually. Also other international NGOs and many, many grassroots organizations, especially in Asia and Africa, where they're very small. Often they're community development organizations who are interested to infuse the human rights approach into what they're doing, and we're training them as well. So the kind of courses we offer are, as you can see, very much oriented towards practice. We do have a course on human rights education, which I teach, and actually most of my students are not teachers. They are actually NGO workers working in the field, and they're infusing the work they do with youth into work they do with youth or with women in their communities. So this is, again, just giving you sort of a bigger picture of human rights education and training. As I mentioned, we offer online courses primarily, which allows us to reach many, many places, because I have a lot of students. Most of my students actually are in Africa at this moment, and go to internet cafes, and that's how we do our teaching. So it's really, I know that we're going to be hearing from Ed about iEARN and what you do, but it's amazing what you can do now, even in these so-called far-flung places, with just the benefit of a computer access once a week. So we have over 1,700 alums, and we have some great instructors. We work in a lot of languages, and it's a really we're really carrying out direct training in that way. We do training and learning materials. A lot is for schools. We are not primarily a curriculum development organization, but we have developed some materials. One which is going to be on display across the street is one we did with Amnesty International, Human Rights and Service Learning, because we thought that was a really good group of students and teachers. They're already interested in community issues and service, and if we could infuse the human rights perspective, which is for us looking at this, not just the symptoms of problems in the community, but the causes, and if we try to link up local with international, we could really deepen and expand the breadth of the service learning work. So we have a guide that we did with Amnesty, which is on display for that. We also, in the last years, we're very troubled by the language in the United States around the Geneva Conventions and the IHL, the lack of understanding in the public around basic international humanitarian law. So we developed an educator's guide to the second edition of Crimes of War, What the Public Should Know. And this educator's guide is, everything we do is online and free, but we also have printed, we also have published some copies. So the educator's guide is only online now, so if you're interested, I can tell you where to find it, but it really addresses some of these very difficult issues around crimes of war, which we developed so that it could be used at upper high school, and also in the first years of college. So I think if you're interested in this topic, I know that those who have been interested to teach crimes of war have found this to be extremely useful. So it's, again, it's not an easy topic to teach, but we've developed this guide, and you're welcome to use it if you'd be interested. We've worked in many other contexts as well. I do a lot of work in post-conflict or post-authoritarian countries still, because systems are in transition then. Education systems are also looking for value systems in a post-conflict society. Northern Ireland or post-totalitarian Europe. So if you're interested, I could talk more about that. I know Facing History is doing work like that as well. But the value system of human rights resonates very well in such societies. We've also worked doing other interesting things with ministries, like in Morocco. We facilitated with the ministry and civil society organizations a gender-based review of Moroccan textbooks for schools. There was a new family code that was passed, and so we used that opportunity to bridge the relationships between the ministry and civil society organizations, primarily women's groups, but we also developed some concrete standards that could be used and are still being used to review proposed textbooks for use in the Moroccan school system. So in terms of resources, this is information for you. We have an electronic resource center, because we see ourselves as much as possible as a kind of a capacity building organization. So we have an online resource center which has over 3,000 free human rights education and training materials. We haven't made those, other people have, but they're available. And we've had the last time we took count was in 2006, but we had almost 1.5 million documents downloaded. which also, again, tells you sort of the power of the internet. And these are downloaded all over the world. And this is the kind of the keyword search you can do. So, again, these are resources we offer, and it's part of what we offer to you as well. The last key area, one of the last key areas for us is also community building and networking. And again, anything you're interested in, I can go into more detail on, because I know the next two speakers will go into rich detail on their work. But I wanted to sort of lay out a broader landscape. Because we do a lot of work online, over the years we've developed a lot of networks. We have something called the Global Human Rights Education Listserv, which has been around for quite some time. And we have on that listserv, we have 6,000 educators in 150 countries, and we have messages going out every week, and it's a way for people to really connect and learn from each other, and it's been a very powerful tool for learning. And we've actually, if anyone is on the listserv this week, you'll be getting a message, because we're going to be co-sponsoring a written statement that's going to go to the Human Rights Council in a couple of weeks around a new declaration for human rights education and training, which is being considered. So we use the listserv not only to share information, but also to get input from grassroots organizations doing human rights education, and in this case, to channel it to Geneva, where the UN is still very much trying to spearhead human rights education efforts. So we have a number of listservs and networks, all of it online and free, that people can participate in, sharings, announcements, and discussions, and we use these as policy tools as well, as I said, because many people doing human rights education and training are individual teachers, or they're small NGOs in other continents, and we try to bring people together to learn and to also to have a voice as appropriate in places like Geneva. So we have partners, we have numbers you can see, but that's part of what we do as well as online community building and networking. And finally, we do some policy development and research and evaluation. We work with the High Commissioner's Office on the World Program, and we did also with the Decade for Human Rights Education. We were actually thrilled. We had an invitation to present on human rights education to the Human Rights Caucus at Congress a couple of years ago. So I think that shows promise, because even in the United States, I don't mean to qualify, but even in the United States, there seems to be some interest here and there at the policy level on the value of education and training vis-a-vis the human rights movement. So again, it's not, they weren't really interested, I have to say honestly, in Congress to hear about what was happening in schools, but they were really interested to hear what we were doing in terms of training human rights defenders. So I think that my time is up, and you've been patient with letting me go a bit longer, but I guess the last piece that I'd say, because I'm eager to hear if anyone has questions about this as well, is since I've been in this field, my concern has been on the one hand that it would be diluted, which is why I have opinions about what I consider human rights education, what's necessary but maybe not sufficient. And I think we need standards in the field, and I hope through our discussions tonight and through the interchange, we'll address that topic. And part of the challenge for human rights education is understanding what makes it unique from global citizenship education. Is it a piece of global citizenship education? Is it separate? These are actually unresolved issues in the field. Often it's attached to education for democratic citizenship, human rights is. But nonetheless, I do feel we need standards, and I also feel that we need good research done. I know Professor Reimers is involved in this, and we try to promote that also at HREA. And right now I'm involved in an impact evaluation of Amnesty International's human rights education programming in 10 countries. So finally we have some data that tries to show the connection between programming and impact on the individual level in 10 countries. And I'm very excited about this research. So I think, again, those of us interested in this field will benefit from understanding what kind of impacts we can have when we have well-designed programs. And I hope to be able to share information like that with you in a year's time or so. So thank you for your attention.
Yeah, that's me. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. So I'm Adam Strom. I'm the Director of Research and Development at Facing History and Ourselves. And actually, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of Facing History and Ourselves approach, where we intersect with this conversation of human rights education, global competency education, and maybe just something to help us think about what are some of the differences. I actually don't come with that real strong bias because I feel like our work's at the intersection of so many of these educational conversations. I also think I think it would be useful to start with a rationale of why in the world is any of this kind of education important. And maybe some of it's obvious, but maybe we also should back up. It'll help us give us some language as we start to think about why we're doing what we're doing. There's actually a wonderful book by Ben Barber a few years ago that I keep going back to. And Ben Barber was talking about that a lot of the problems that we face in the world right now are not problems that stay within neat national borders, whether it's disease. Remember people a couple years ago were talking about the avian flu virus, whether it's AIDS, SARS. Is this stuff going to stay inside a national border? And then also collective violence. Issues of genocide don't stay within borders. As you've watched in Congo now, the genocide in Rwanda, people say, wait a minute, why is the Rwandan government interested in what's going on in Congo? The world doesn't come in neat packages. I think we once could have pretended that, what stays inside one country doesn't affect anyone else. But it reminds me of some work Raphael Lemkin did in the aftermath of the Armenian genocide. Raphael Lemkin was asking a law professor about the state of international law at that time. And so maybe some of you know the story from Samantha Power's book, A Problem from Hell. So Lemkin was trying to figure out why in the world the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide weren't on trial. And he said to his law professor, why is this? And the law professor said, look, it's like chickens. A farmer can do with his chickens whatever he wants to, and if you get involved, it's not your business. And he said, but human beings aren't chickens. And I think the problems that we face in the world don't stay self-contained. These are other people's business. What we actually do about other people's business is another story to be debated, and I think that's a real politic, actually, that you want to bring up with a student. There isn't one easy answer to any of these problems. Economics, I don't need to tell you about how globally connected we are looking at the stock market this afternoon. And issues of global migration are probably the most visible face, I think, of globalization and how interconnected we are. And so Fernando began, and he started talking about the role of schools in that. And so some of the work I've done the last couple of years has been reading memoirs of young immigrants, talking about going to schools around the world. And Fernando was talking about, are their rights really protected? What's their experiences like in the school? So I'm going to give you just one of the most interesting memoirs I read the last couple of years. It's a bizarre entry point, but it was by Zacarias Moussaoui's brother. If you remember Zacarias Moussaoui, he was considered the 20th hijacker in the September 11th attacks. And he talks about he and his brother's experience going to school in France. In school in France outside of Marseille, he talks about this teacher that would follow all the North African kids to the bathroom every day. And all the kids and all the teachers in school knew who it was. And the teacher would follow the kids in schools and literally beat them up. And nobody said anything. So you talk about basic human rights standards. What do they look like on a personal level into the classroom? So how are countries going to learn to live with these differences? And what are the differences that we're going to be comfortable with over time? So I think that's one picture. And then the other is, I think Felisa started to talk about it. At least I think it's an important awareness point. How aware people are of the post-World War II emerging global structures here? What kind of literacy and what kind of familiarity do people have with this stuff? So the post-World War II system has created all kinds of covenants, all kinds of agreements, all kinds of international criminal courts. And if young people are going to be part of the conversation about these things, they need to actually know what they are. So it's really amazing to me that as we've just been doing some work, actually, I'll get into it a little bit more later, on Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I think you'll love, the book that we end up working on. But how many of those covenants that people who I think consider themselves well-educated know nothing about, and yet are being asked to participate as global citizens and think about these issues? It's a real challenge. So where does Facing History fit in this dialogue? Like I said, I think that we're at the intersection of a lot of conversations around here. Our roots actually are here at Harvard Grad School of Education with some of Lawrence Kohlberg's work in the 1970s looking at moral development education and really starting, actually the executive director was a student of Kohlberg's. But I also think that, as Felisa said, those boundaries between what is civic education and what does it mean to be global civic education and what is human rights education and what's just good history education and good social studies education. I'm not sure, again, that I want to come down and say this is what facing history is. I would just suggest that there's a lot of conversations, that those definitions aren't always so clear, and maybe it's okay that they're not so clear all of the time, at least for me. Fernando actually said this to me the other day, so I need to say it again, that facing history's approach has been global since the beginning of our work, and I'll explain what that means in a little bit more in a second. But our approach has always been to look at somebody else's story from another part of the world, to reflect on it, and start to think about what connections does it offer us? What can we learn from other people's stories? So I think of what we do as really kind of indirect human rights education, which isn't to say that the content of specific rights are not part of the language, but it's not necessarily the primary focus of facing history and ourselves education. And again, I'll get into a little bit more depth in just a second. But we measure student success differently than I think than that first framework you're talking about, what's going on in the students, about rights awareness, where our issues aren't as much about rights awareness or advocacy, but they're on student and teacher reflection about action. And that I almost feel like that's a prerequisite for actually getting involved in human rights work, to start to be reflective about how your action starts to influence other people and the climate around you. And then what we do is we provide resources, and there are all kinds of things. There are print resources, or there are resources that are literally staffed to start to work with teachers, that are online resources. And again, I'll get into some of that. But the Facing History and Ourselves approach, and Felisa focused on one part of her work primarily, and I think I'll do the same thing. I'll focus primarily on our work with teachers of adolescents in formal school settings. Some of you are here at Harvard, so you know that we also do higher education programs, and maybe some of you are in Bob Selman's class. But that's really not the primary focus of our work. So the idea of our work, in some ways, is to transform curriculum through working with teachers. And that means, again, as I said, providing professional development. It's a development of educational resources and follow-up. It's a very, very teacher and staff-intensive approach because we're trying to transform teachers to transform students. And it's a humanities-based approach. Facing History is really interested in using stories, historically grounded stories, that illuminate the choices that individuals, groups, and nations make, often in the face of injustice and sometimes in the opportunity to try to make a difference. But it's stories. I mean, it's actually where we emerged out of the moral development field is instead of doing the hypotheticals, why don't you actually ground this in something real, in the real politics of real choices? I think increasingly those stories have become more human rights explicit, but not all of them. And so we're really, as I was saying before, we're really looking to get students, and it's a kind of a core belief at Facing History, that when you look at somebody else's story, that you'll start to increase your capacity to start to reflect on yourself and your own society and the choices that you make within that society. Again, that's really important. Felisa's talking about post-conflict areas. And so a lot of people think that when you go into a post-conflict area to do educational work, that you should be doing direct education about the conflict. It's kind of people's first kind of assumption that you go and you really face that history and you really confront it. Actually, Facing History's educational approach has been it found that it's really useful to provide some distance, somebody else's story, instead of getting in your face. And then people make authentic, real-life connections to that material, and there's a safer space in that classroom. So some of the desired outcomes that we're looking for. Is that my phone? Someone else's phone? I hope it's not my phone. I could have that. Yeah, it was. Look, it's a Rudolph Giuliani moment from the campaign. So what we're doing is we're looking to, for teachers, we're really looking to promote their capacity to foster students' historical understanding. There's a lot of more information about all this on the website. The ability to promote students' social awareness, the ability to promote student civic learning. And this is really the kind of research and evaluation that Facing History does. This is what we know we do. For students, we're interested in their academic engagement, motivation, and knowledge of history, social and moral development, reduction in racist attitudes, awareness of anti-Semitism, and fostering group tolerance of other ethnic groups, promoting civic knowledge, skills, and values, promoting conversations and inquiry that we really think are the foundations of any kind of discussion about human rights. You talk about the principles and standards. I think in the spirit of how often is it direct human rights education, that's something we're thinking about. But we also, and this is really something that Molly Shen, who's here today, can talk about more than I, Facing History thinks of ourselves as a real model for school reform. So what we've done over the time is we've had an essential framework that's worked, that's looked at some core themes and different historical material. Our primary work has been on the rise of the Nazis and using that as an opportunity to look at how a democracy can get dismantled and how that doesn't just happen like often is presented in the textbook. Bad thing happened. Oh, well, that's too bad. We believe actually, again, often people think if you can give students those horrible stories, they'll become more tolerant. Our approach has actually found that it's not true. You actually have to slow that history down and start to help people understand that these things happen step by step by step, choice by choice, back and forth. And again, it's in slowing that down that students start to find connections back to their own communities. So the themes that we really start to touch on in that approach, and it appears in all of our work, is looking at the relationship between the individual and society, how my identity might be influenced by the group I'm in, but also maybe by the people around me. The influence of group and national membership and labeling, especially issues of race and religion, which is some work that we're doing on right now. And really some helping students understand how fragile democracy is. You need people to protect it. It's easy. Democracy goes away quite easily. I think people could talk more about, I won't get into politics. But again, it's a dismantling of a civil society when people aren't vigilant. And again, when they're not looking out for where the laws are changing, how are the choices that people are making, are they choosing to ignore this, speak up? So we're really looking at how students, individuals, and groups redefine a concept that Helen Fine, a sociologist here, has talked about, their universe of obligation, the group of people to which they think their rights matter, that they care about. She actually originally developed that term as a warning sign for genocide. When people's nation's universe of obligations were shrinking, she said that was a prerequisite, that you're heading towards a danger zone. Fernando and I have had some conversations about Venezuela the last couple of weeks. But breaking those things apart, looking at the role of the media, looking at the role of propaganda and shaping, again, how people think and act. The role of violence and fear, again, in getting people to think that they have agency, that they could go out and make a difference, or do they feel too afraid of the state around them. Looking at issues of conformity and obedience, the role of bystanders and upstanders. And then the steps leading to the implementation of genocide, because I think it's important in some of our work to realize that all those things that I talked about before have consequences. They're not just little abstract choices, that actually they end up affecting human lives in ways that people may not have understood in those small moments just at the beginning. And then ultimately looking at issues of judgment and justice in the aftermath of violence, and then participation. So if those were the things that made a democracy weak, what are the things that individuals, groups, and nations can do to strengthen it, to fill in? I always think of those cracks. Every country has its cracks. Who's working to close those cracks? So my job as the Director of Research and Development is often, but not always, fun. What I get to do is, as Fernando said, is I get to help us think about some of the new projects that we're taking on and help the organization stay timely and relevant, knowing that, again, as I mentioned before, the world is changing. The organization's been around 32 years. Some of the issues and themes that we thought about have really started to change. And so what I think is what we do is a precarious balance between balancing what teachers are really in school systems need, and we can talk about some of that, and a desire for Facing History to be a leader in the field of both education, but also in the study of the particular contents that we look at. And this is a balance. So we balance ourselves between producing curriculum for some of the district-wide work that we've been doing. So Facing History does district-wide work in a number of cities in the United States, actually now doing some countrywide work in Northern Ireland. So there's a balance between providing school curricula versus resources. And why that makes a difference for us is because we want teachers to take some ownership of developing their own curriculum and their own rationale for what they're teaching. But it's, as Fernando says to us all the time, it's labor-intensive work, and that requires a professional teaching force. So where I think we've been also very, at least paying a lot of attention, is that selection of content. What are the stories that we want to tell, considering how the world is changing? So some of the books that we've been developing right now in response to some of the issues I was talking about before is a new book, and you see the cover of it right there. Stories of Identity, Religion, Migration, and Belonging in a Changing World. And what this book is, it's an anthology of stories of pretty much young immigrants and communities struggling with integration. And a lot of them are first-person stories. The story I told you about Massawi's brother is one of the books in there. And really, if you're talking about developing global competencies, I think the most important, the starting point is how in the world are we going to learn to live with each other when many of us came with an assumption that we're going to live in communities that were going to be kind of like us. Well, very few communities are that homogenous anymore. And thank goodness for that. But how are we going to negotiate those differences? So one of the other books that we've done as part of that series is looking at it as a school-based dilemma. We've just done a book on the debate over the headscarves in the French public schools. They were, again, struggling with integration of difference and what do you do with that? And trying to look at that and try to understand what was going on behind those debates. What were the conversations about national identity, individual identity, and religious difference? And trying to use this to provoke all of us, I think, to think about what are the kinds of differences that we want to live with in our own classroom, and what are some of our assumptions about what does it mean to be normal in our community. For anybody who's interested, we're doing an online workshop that's free for that at the end of March, and just go to our website and sign up. It's called Civic Dilemmas, Religion, Migration, and Belonging. I hope you all take it. I think it's going to be great. But also what we've been trying to do is globalize what we think of as civic learning. As I said, if you don't know these new international institutions, how in the world can you participate in a conversation? So the first of the books that we've done recently around that was a book called Totally Unofficial. And it began where I began, looking at Raphael Lemkin and just the understanding of the Genocide Convention. It may be the most direct example of human rights education and Facing History's work, looking at kind of a key principle of human rights and where in the world that idea came from. So again, any of these things you can download for free from the website. We're working, the second one we did, I think also as a fabulous story of human rights protests, is a story of, it's called Stitching Truth. It's a story of women, particularly marginalized women in Chile, who were trying to find a way to speak out to the stories of the disappeared. Their husbands or brothers, their children had been disappeared. And these are the stories of very, very marginalized women who are trying to have a political voice. And they ended up telling their stories, actually, initially through quilts, organized through the Catholic Church. The thought was maybe they'd get together and sew some handcrafts together. And instead of just simply doing that, they ended up sewing into art the stories of the disappearances of their family. International human rights organizations like Amnesty International started touring those quilts around, and it transformed the way that these women thought of themselves. From people who thought of themselves as marginalized, really thought of themselves as advocates, activists, who had the ability to make a difference. And these stories are so important for people around the world because so many people think of themselves as people who can't make a difference. They think of themselves as so marginalized that nothing I can do can speak out. And it's a fabulous story because you say, well, wait a minute. Who are these young women? Where did they find the power to start to make a difference? What can we learn from them? And besides, their art is absolutely beautiful. And then the newest guide, which is in development, which I want to talk to Felisa about a lot more, is we're doing one on the formation of the Declaration of Human Rights and looking at Eleanor Roosevelt's role in guiding that committee. So often, I think you're talking about human rights education so often being surface level. We want to try to jump it back into its historical context. And what was going on in that post-World War II moment that allowed, I think, the sensitivity that Fernando pointed to in Article 26, but also the broad thinking about international covenants. So what was going on? So I don't need to go into all of these, but these are trying to deepen the scope, give us a little bit more information on all those different themes, developing material that would both be print and online. There's a wonderful film we've just done as a young immigrant and a human rights activist named Arnchorn Pond called Everyone Has a Story. Again, you can find the film on YouTube. And it's a great story for teachers to think about. It's a story of an immigrant from Cambodia who is a survivor of the Cambodian genocide, who goes to a school. He claims to be the first bilingual student in the state of New Hampshire. So imagine coming from the killing fields of Cambodia and months later finding themselves the only Cambodian kid, not only in a school, but in the state. And what is a school going to do to try to help this young kid find his voice? These, I think, are the stories that young people should be looking at as they start to think about who's different, who the young voices in their own schools that they may not be hearing, may not even be asking the questions about. Every time I see iEARN speak, you look at this one child who's often, the one kid tucked off in the corner, and I'll come up to iEARN and say, I have a story. Nobody's listened to me yet. So hopefully this will inspire people to talk about this. There's all kinds of other resources that we develop because we believe the classroom can't really exist in isolation. So whether it's about exhibitions, art exhibits, online courses, conferences. But I also wanted to think about some of the challenges in doing this kind of work. So the first challenge is that ethnic, religious, economic conflict doesn't seem to be going away, does it? And so young people know that adults actually haven't been very effective at making a difference. So you get some cynicism and some frustration, and kids whose lives have really been in conflict. Say, what good is this stuff anyway? What's happened in the last 60 years to show me that you have any strength to make a difference? And then low levels of global literacy among teachers and students. How many of y'all were familiar with the structure around human rights education until Fernando and Felisa began to lay that stuff out? I think teachers don't have a lot of information, a lot of background in global literacy. But our work really, this is and I think it's a positive. This kind of work that we believe is transformative for the teacher and transformative for the student, but it takes a lot of time. It means a lot of time working with teachers, and it takes a lot of time in the classroom. We're doing work in the UK, and they can give us, they talk about we could crush it in 3 weeks of class time. And for Facing History, we've studied our approach, but we've studied 6 to 10-week units. And so we know what kind of transformational educational approach it'll be in a 6 to 10-week unit. What do you do when a system doesn't have that kind of room? The current testing culture, I don't think I need to tell you this, has not emphasized these skills or content areas. There's some interesting work done by a woman at Teachers College, Nicole Vartanian, has looked at human rights standards and the lack of money that's gone into implementing human rights standards, the lack of professional development. The good thing is that students are engaged by these stories. And actually, I think students often have a different entry point than their teachers when they come in here. I think, I was talking to Fernando again last week about some students in Germany. So over 50% of the students in the schools in Germany are of migrant background, but less than 1% of the teachers are of migrant backgrounds themselves. So students come in actually often with different experiences, living in other places or families that have lived other places. They may feel far more connected globally than the teachers themselves. And that can be, again, an opportunity for learning, or it could be a chance of conflict. So again, I think that many of these issues would play into really important adolescent questions about their own sense of responsibility to others, to groups, to people that they may be considering their friends. And again, this is a real great opportunity to dig deep. Human rights education, global education for global competencies gives kids a chance, I think, to start to think about some of their own adolescent issues that may be far more local than the framework of the education, but they still have to build authentic connections. So if we're going to be doing this work, we need to prioritize professional development around this. You need high-quality educational resources. And right now, I'm hoping that the educational environment will change and more opportunities will connect. There's all kinds of movements that intersect with this, whether it's a 21st century school skills movement or other kind of language. But it's really important for those of you who are teachers and those of you who are administrators to start to think about when is the time to get professional development. Are schools making this a priority, and how can you help that? And I'll just leave you with some quotes that give you a sense of what kind of transformation that this stuff can inspire among young people. So from a young student, talking about, a Facing History teacher, it's completely transformed how I see myself, the classroom, and the world. From a alumni, who's to say that Facing History cannot be the catalyst for an end to prejudice, violence, and injustice? A parent, In no other course has my daughter been inspired to use the whole of her spiritual, moral, and intellectual resources to solve a problem. So again, it's a teacher, it's a student, and it's back at the community to do this kind of educational work. So thank you all so much.
Hi, my name's Ed Gragert, and I'm with iEARN USA, and I need some help. I need some help from some people up here. I like to hold this up, and as you heard from my bio, my background is actually Asian history. And so as a professor of Asian history, I always felt a little naked not having maps in front of me. So just to be sure tonight, I brought two. They look very different. And for those of you who can see it, can you all hear me without the mic? Yeah. For those of you, it's okay. For those of you who can see them, these maps are quite different, right? Some of you, I'm sure, are aware of why. Which one is most common or are you most familiar with? The one that probably is in your school if you're a teacher. The one on the left somebody's pointing to. Why are they different? How are they different? This is the experiential part.
The one on the right is the actual relative size. The one on the left takes into account the curvature of the globe. Is that?
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
Technology gets in the way. Yeah, that's great. There's another difference. Sure.
God's country, USA is in the middle on the left.
All right. Great difference, okay?
And from Russia, in Russia, they would never split up Russia in two.
Cut in half. Right. These are all great observations. You know, and you know, whenever you got a globe and you put it on a flat surface, there's going to be distortion. We all know that. But the issue is how you choose to distort. Do you put one continent in the middle? Do you cut one in half? Or, now this is where you point to the equator over here. Find the equator on that map. Right in the middle, right? It's not in the middle, folks. It's in the south. Way down there. What does that do to the northern hemisphere? Makes it big. Southern hemisphere squishes it, right? Not important. And I used to be in the international exchange field, and I had two exchangees in my office, and I had this map on my wall, and there was a student from Switzerland and a student from Bolivia. And the student from Bolivia looked at this map and said, "My God, my country's huge." And the kid from Switzerland actually couldn't find Switzerland first. He said, "No, there's something wrong. My country can't be that small." And I argue that in that moment there was a transformation of how those two students viewed the world, but also themselves. And I use this analogy. Thank you. I use this analogy because for the first time in history, all of us, those of us who are in education in different ways, those of us who are citizens, have the potential, instead of relying on traditional resources, the media, sometimes textbooks, instead of relying on just those, we now have the possibility of having our students work directly with other students, to go directly to the source and get their information from there. Now I'm going to see if this is going to project right. Well, we'll see. Isn't technology great? Okay. And so what I'd like to do is, and I'm going to follow that theme actually for the next few minutes, and I realize it's also 10 of 7, so we're going to go, okay? Is that all right? Okay. And so back in 1988, some of the issues that Adam just shared with you, obviously issues that were there in 1988 as well, in terms of issues facing the planet. And primarily among those was the fact that there were two countries literally at war with ICBM missiles pointing at each other across the Atlantic. And so, like educators looking at that experientially, how had we been prepared to deal with those issues? It was pretty dismal. And so we looked around to see how can we give different kinds of tools to young people so that as part of the educational process, starting at age 5, they could, in fact, interact with the rest of the world as part of their curriculum, and not only learn those subject areas better, which we'll talk about, but also become global citizens, recognizing that there are real people out there, and they speak different languages, and they think differently. And so those are the two pillars of what we do. We give the students responsibility, under the guidance, of course, of the teacher, which we'll talk about, for part of their own learning, and that they will learn better, but also they'll act on that learning. So, face it, I'm an adult, and when I think of the issues that we're all dealing with, how can I, as one person, make a difference? And because you can imagine what it means to a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old in terms of how that kid envisions that. So the first thing we wanted to do is find teachers who get it, who understand that kids can be empowered to investigate things with the assistance of a teacher and actually act on it. So we listened to classroom teachers. And here's one we listened to.
Welcome to our Sunnyside Pond Water Habitat Project. All school year, we study a local pond water habitat at the city's Sunnyside Park near our school.
The ducks are putting their yellow noses into the water. Why do you think they might be doing that?
The ducks could be putting their beaks in the water to catch the water inside.
They could be.
One of the first projects that we had an idea to go online with was taking our environmental science study of a local pond habitat where children were making observations and take what that piece was that we were already doing in the classroom and take that into the next step of using that as the content of communication.
We're just going to check to see what the pH is. And
with the goal of hoping that as they communicated about their local habitat, they would find connections and diversities between this local habitat and other water habitats in different locations around the world.
We can send our pond writing documents as email messages to other schools around the world who are studying water habitats with us.
Kind of my overarching goal for that curriculum is that they start to develop an understanding that waterways and water systems throughout the world have a connectivity to them.
We had this artwork from Lara Primary. It's a school in Australia. They have this sanctuary for endangered birds.
They're writing to an audience of their peers with a purpose about something they know really well and want to share.
This year there are lots of mallard ducks swimming in the big pond. Sometimes we have seen 40 ducks, and sometimes we have seen 200.
Their peers value it, and they get an immediate response back that says, "Thank you for telling me about the pond. Thank you for telling us about your mallard ducks. We don't have mallard ducks here." So anything that's on the screen from our classroom is embedded in real life, developmentally appropriate, hands-on, real-world experiences that the children have. I think the important thing to remember is that it's not a matter of the technology replacing those experiences in this classroom. It's a matter of using that technology to publish, communicate, share, work with the ideas of the things that children should be doing in first and second grade. The real human interactions, the real world interactions. We're just using that technology to help us understand that better.
And that teacher and the students realized that the water in the other countries that they were working with was cleaner than theirs, their pond. And so they said, we have a right to have cleaner water in our town. And so they went to the city council and actually petitioned that the town should clean up that pond. So this is kind of a microcosm. So what we do, starting in 1988, 20 years ago, we linked a few schools in those countries at war to demonstrate that this could be possible. And we started at age 5 because we wanted kids to get that mentality that they, in fact, can work together with peers, their own age, on meaningful project work. And as you heard earlier, we have programs in 125 countries with 33,000 member teachers and about 2 million students every day. 2 million folks working together on projects that we'll talk about. Now, 2 million seems large. We're kind of the largest, but compared to the billions of kids that are out there that could be doing this, it's a drop in the bucket. And then we believe firmly that we don't have the answers, so we collaborate, and we'll talk about that with all sorts of human rights groups and other organizations. In fact, one of the wonderful parts about this evening is I already heard, I've worked with Facing History in the past a little bit, but listen to Felisa, there's some real areas that we could be working together here. So through iEARN, students move from learning about human rights to learning about that through interaction directly with students in other countries on a daily basis. And this is all premised in our network on the assumption that there's wisdom out there. And one of our founders in Argentina was quite fond of this quote, that no one knows so much that he or she can't learn from another, and that no one knows so little that he or she can't teach the other. And so that realization that you're fostering in students, that there's something to learn from someone who lives all around the world. And so the premises on which we work is that the technology student allows students to go anywhere in the world and collect that wisdom and share that wisdom and teach others. And that if the issues that face this planet, both in terms of human rights but also environmental degradation, are human-made, then the solutions can also be dealt with by bringing people together and having them work together on those issues at as early an age as possible. So I took a few issues, because human rights is not my background. I said, well, okay, all the work that's happening out there, there's about 250 projects. Let's look at them in terms of what kind of content they have in terms of this field. So I just picked 6. There are 250 projects happening. So I looked at one dealing with the issues of a right to avoid hunger, gender equality, to be free from communicable diseases, have an environment that's sustainable, and that involve global partnerships, and these are all from the MDGs, and also dealing with child labor. So looking at the first one, hunger. There's a wonderful project, folks, called Feeding Minds, Fighting Hunger. And this is an example of how we partner with another organization. This is an FAO, UNESCO curriculum, K-12, on how to deal with hunger. And they came to us and they said, look, we know that this is a great curriculum. We know that teachers are interested in it. But what's happening is they're teaching this in an isolated environment. And so a teacher over here in one place in the United States is teaching this, teacher in another in a school in France or a school in Ghana is teaching it. But what's missing is that the kids are not seeing hunger as a global issue. They're seeing it only as a local issue or a national issue. And so we created the space online for students, teachers who are teaching the same thing, to actually have their students dialogue about that issue, in this case, hunger. And we don't have time to go into discussion. You see that little thing there? I will on some of them, okay? Promote gender equality. So teachers, and in this case teachers in Iran, said we would like to have our students explore women in our country. And so teachers from around the world came together and said, okay, our students would love to work on that too. And so they instituted this project worldwide on issues of gender equality, roles of women, obviously in politics, as you can see, but other fields as well. And in this case, let's look at a little bit and see what they're talking about. And this is always a fear that things aren't going to work. Let's see. Oh. Yeah, we'll see. Come on. it's trying. You know, this is where you load everything in advance and something you're tested, and then you take it over in the other room and it has to redo everything. Pardon me? Okay. So there's a space online where they share all sorts of media, text, videos, images, all things like that. And then they come down and they discuss. Oh, look at this. Whoa. You know, I was talking to Adam beforehand, and he said we were talking about actually the scarves issue in France. And I said, yeah, students around the world and I are talking about religious differences and clothing differences based on their faith. And he asked me, oh, is it between France and the United States? I said, no, it's between students in the Middle East, particularly. And I just want to get across again, it's hard to convince people this is happening every day in all these countries. And so just to give you a sense, here are kids talking about roles of women in Afghanistan today, women in religion, women in my country, in Kenya, women in government and politics. And you notice the flags are from all over the world. And I wish I had time to go in and read some of them. They're great. But it's an example of how an issue about gender equality can be formed by what's happening in the classroom by educators and put in a context in a project-based learning format in which students come from all over the world and discuss and then share and then act on that learning. HIV, AIDS, malaria. There's a great eradication of malaria project. And students analyze the causes, effects. They look at issues of insects. They look at issues of treatment. They look at issues of financial implications. And it was started by kids and teachers in Botswana. And a couple days ago, as you can see from this one, it is, again, all over the world. But a couple of days ago, or maybe just yesterday, a friend of mine, actually a student I know in Sierra Leone, because I met him there, wrote, I'm a Sierra Leonean, and we all know my country has once been a place called the white man's grave because of the colonial situation. And so it's up to, and this is where I have to scroll, looks like. It's up to, come on, up to date. It's my concern to voice it out for killing my people every day. My cousin, and he's talking about malaria. My cousin was laid away last month by malaria. I believe provisions are to be made to prevent people before eradicating it. And so you get a personal story. You talk about Adam. Adam talked earlier about the value, the importance of stories. And here it is, kids telling their story. And can you imagine if you were a student here, and, whoops, I have to go down, and you read that, and another person comes in, hey, Josta, this is from Botswana. I agree with you that malaria is such a dangerous disease in that part of Africa, meaning West Africa. My own father died from it, and this motivated me to fight the disease through education, because had I been educated by then when he was still alive, I would have prevented his death. But we were living in a village, and I knew very little about the prevention. Education is power. In Botswana, we do annual campaigns where the students teach the households how to prevent the disease, actually with nets, and giving them nets and educating them. Another student. What flag is that one, guys? This is a test. I'm sorry to hear that you've lost somebody. So these are personal stories. And there's nothing that grips, because kids in our country can read about malaria all the time, as I did as a kid. And until they hear somebody who's been impacting, all of a sudden becomes real. And I have a right to not have to face that as a student in Botswana. And so that is how this works. And then all of a sudden the Canadians were, I blew it. The Canadians were involved, the students, and they were doing this campaign. They actually got a lot of students raised money to buy nets in Botswana. And then they discovered that it was their own country that had the highest rate of malaria outside of the tropics. They didn't know that. But again, it brought the issue back home to study within Canada itself. I'm really curious as to why that is, actually. A fourth one, to ensure environmental sustainability. You know, we have a right that our forests aren't plowed down, and that especially for northern industries. And so students said, okay, we don't know what deforestation is in this country. It's hard for our kids to understand that, and in a lot of countries. And so they said, okay, we want to do something about it. We're going to make PSAs, public service announcements, to educate others in our community about the importance of saving our trees, because we have a right to have trees in the future. And so the kids in India, at the same time they did all of the various things that the skills for the 21st century require in terms of digital skills and editorial skills, they did a video or animation. They did a lot of them. They're great. Again, ensuring environmental sustainability. You know, climate change and global warming are such big issues, and you know, turn off the lights is one thing I could do, and all those kinds of things. But kids need to talk to each other about the impact that my actions have on your life. And so we have Our Footprints, Our Future, which I won't go to, but you can have your students go to right there. And what they do is they calculate, of course, their footprint, but they go the next step. They compare it with schools in different countries. They compare it with different ages. And by the way, the 13-year-olds are the most effective in terms of reducing their footprint. They compare it against gender, all those kinds of things. And they have a collective goal to reduce carbon dioxide by 50,000 tons in this year, but 2 million kids working. But then they go the next step and take that action, and they work together online about how they did it and what actions they took. We, as I mentioned, work with a number of organizations. We work with Cyber School Bus, which runs the UN Student Conference on Human Rights every year at the United Nations. And so they wanted a place for their students who come together. And usually it was like about 30 kids who come together at the UN to discuss this. But what about the 3 billion out there that don't come? And so I said, how about if kids have a chance to talk online about these human rights issues before they come, and of course during, and then after. And so it really it broadens the interaction and the discussion. And so we created that space for them. We also partner with a number of technology companies to provide various kinds of hardware, software in areas, because kids have a right to access that kind of equipment and those kinds of skills if they're going to be successful in the 21st century. That cannot be the monopoly of only certain parts of the world. Child labor. I mean, kids look at this. Actually, the kids in Australia, as you can see, said, we want to do this project because no child should have to work. They should be in school. Very cut and dry, black and white. And American kids say, yeah, right. And the kid wrote in from Kenya and said, hold it, folks. If I don't go out and work, my family doesn't eat. And that stopped everybody in their tracks. All right, how do we deal with this? And so they talked about this various issue in terms of socioeconomic conditions, employment issues, health issues, and they said what's really important is that education not be the one thing that gets sacrificed. So let's work together in a small project. We're going to create a little school where those kids are working in the field so that they get their education where they are instead of having to give up what their family needs. And so it turned a black and white issue into something that was quite gray, but still dealt with the issue of child labor. As a result of each one of these projects, there's some sort of a product. Actually, this is a publication they do. This is how I learned about camel drivers. You guys know about camel drivers? It is the biggest, somebody knows? All right. Well, the biggest human rights issue for kids in the Gulf area, for example. And the kids are coming, they grab the kids from Pakistan and Bangladesh and countries like that at age 5, 6, 4, and take them to some of the Gulf countries to drive the camels in the races. And they serve as drivers as long as they're small, and then they have to leave. And so I had no idea that that issue even existed. But these kids shared it with me and shared it with everybody else in their online work, and they then took action. They wrote letters to the ambassador from Kuwait and Saudi in their country of Pakistan about, you can't take our kids anymore to do this. And again, it's ways that all sorts of information, but also action, is shared student to student. But I'm convinced, we're convinced, that this concept of person-to-person wisdom out there everywhere in the world is a fact. And that our kids everywhere in the world are going to benefit if they have that chance, whether it's exploring human rights issues or exploring whatever part of the curriculum. And I'm willing to take a risk and try it right now. So here's 12 people. Without saying a word to anyone near you, come up with a number of faces that you recognize. Have we got a number? Okay. What I'm going to do is ask you to hold up your hand and hold it up as long as you can. I'm going to count the numbers, okay? So those of you who know at least one person up there on the screen, raise your hand. All right. How about 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, some hands are coming down, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All right. That's never happened to me before. I'd like you to talk to the people around you now. Who do you know in common? Turn around in your seat, ask the person next to you. Who are these people? All right, we're short of time. All right. And the first observation I would make is that it's hard to stop you and you're having fun. And hopefully education can be fun and motivating and stimulating. And I dare say, if I asked you now, based on that collective wisdom of the people around you, how many people you know up there, your hands would stay up longer. And that's kind of why we do this, is because students can learn about everything in their curriculum, human rights and everything else, by learning directly with other students together under the direction of a teacher as part of a collaborative project work in the curriculum. But you wouldn't like it if I didn't show you this, right? All right, is there somebody up there you don't recognize? Is there a name you don't recognize? Come on, you didn't know all of them. Is there a name you don't recognize? Wangari Maathai, who is she? All right, she is from Kenya, won the Nobel Peace Prize for her environmental work. First time that ever happened. Is there another unfamiliar one? The last one, Rigoberta Menchú, Guatemala, Nobel Peace Prize for Literature. And you're proving my point, guys. And I dare say that if we went down this list, the collective wisdom in this room would answer it and would contribute to your own knowledge. And that's why we do what we do. And I thank you.